Hi, and welcome back to the Shane Plays Notes series for White Plume Mountain from the 5th edition version of the Classic Dungeon from Tales from the Yawning Portal, which updates 7 classic adventures to 5th edition. We've been having a great time. Um, the players in this session are right on the verge of confronting the vampire again, who delivered their rears to them in their last encounter with him. So we'll find out here in a moment how that went. Um, if you're new to this series, this is not an actual video of the play of the game. This is my recap of DMing this module with my group at my friendly local game store, and my thoughts on dungeon mastering and GMing and rules and just different stuff like that. So this video has a high level of engagement, this video series, so I enjoy doing it. I appreciate your comments and questions and clarifications and that sort of thing. So if you're new to it, please keep watching. If you're a returning viewer, longtime viewer, I'm so happy to have you as well. Make sure to leave this video a thumbs up on YouTube. That helps me out a lot. And then, maybe leave a comment or whatever, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. So, White Plume Mountain again it's just considered a funhouse dungeon. It's one of the classic dangerous, fatal dungeons of D&D history, but it also has some pretty big rewards. So, but it's a lot about problem solving and puzzles rather than making total coherent sense. But anyway, having said all that, let's dig right in and see what viewer feedback we have, and then after that we'll get into the recap of last session. So let me put on my +3 spectacles of viewer feedback, and let's see what you, the viewers, had to say. First, I'm going to start with I normally don't do viewer feedback from past episodes. It's usually just the most previous episode. I'll do viewer feedback for the next episode. But every now and then something pumps up. I'm like, I want to make sure to mention that. So, Nagatsu-san on episode 4 commented, he said, seems like Blackrazor is actually Stormbringer, but just outside copyright infringement. If you don't know, there's a classic fantasy series by Michael Moorcock, and it features a character named Elric. Some people say Elric of Melnibone. I think the actual pronunciation is Melnibone. If I'm, feel free to correct me in the comments, but he has a sword that is this like dark energy sword. It's thirsty. It has its own mind. It was crafted. It's basically an alien being that is in the form of the sword, and it drinks people's souls and gives you their strength. And Elric hates it, even though Elric, it saves his life and it did it all this. It lets him be incredibly proficient in battle. He hates it, and it's basically Blackrazor. Which that didn't even click on me until Nagatsu-san pointed this out. So I went back and looked, and sure enough, Lawrence Schick, who wrote White Plume Mountain, you can go to the Stormbringer Wikipedia page. You can also go to the White Plume Mountain Wikipedia page, and it's mentioned on both. But I quote the Stormbringer Wikipedia page, and you can go to the comments on video 4 if you want to see this. But Lawrence Schick said, or it says it features a magical sword called Blackrazor, a black-bladed vampiric blade created from an extra-dimensional being. Schick later said that he was, quote, a little embarrassed to this day by Blackrazor, inasmuch as it's such a blatant ripoff of Elric Stormbringer. I would not have put it into the scenario if I ever thought it might be published. So here's a little history. Lawrence Schick wrote White Plume Mountain really almost like a resume or an interview. He wrote this dungeon to show to TSR, to show that he had the chops to write adventures, because he wanted TSR to hire him. TSR looked at it, hired him, and then published it as is. And Lawrence, says in his own words, I think this is on the White Plume Mountain Wikipedia page, he says that, well, I wasn't actually expecting it to get published because it was just a puzzle solving set of scenarios that, it just showed that I could do all these different kinds of scenarios and things. And so he was surprised that TSR just published it as is, Blackrazor and all. So Nagatsu-san, good catch on Blackrazor basically being Stormbringer from Elric. And then Nagatsu-san also points out that the first print of many AD&D source books included characters or creatures from Tolkien, Lovecraft, Moorcock, etc., but were quickly removed for obvious legal concerns. That happened. I think it was either Legends and Lore. I think Legends and Lore, the original Deities and Demigods, or what was it called? Deities and Demigods. I've actually got it up on my shelf. Had Cthulhu mythos stuff in it that had to get pulled over copyright, if I understand correctly. And then I think I'm not sure about Moorcock, but I know that Tolkien, like basically the original D&D was Tolkien. I mean, that was what the people of the day had to draw on for fantasy. And I think originally, like original D&D, maybe even White Box, I'm not sure, they were called hobbits. A hobbit's not that big, but I'm just showing something small. And I think there was a legal issue there, so they changed it to halfling, even though halfling is mentioned in the Tolkien books as another name for hobbits. I guess halfling was okay, even though hobbit wasn't. So I love that kind of history. Thanks for bringing that stuff up. Nagatsu-san. Okay, so now to the comments on video 11. Had a couple of different takes on, I did that thing last video where I said, what really grinds my gears? And I talked about how, like, you have a player who something really horrible either happens to their character or is about to happen to their character. And instead of adding to the atmosphere and going, oh no, they're like, oh, cool, and it's subjective. It's not objective. It's a play style. It's not necessarily wrong depending on the tone of the group. But when I'm running an adventure that is obviously not just for giggles, this is intended to, White Plume Mountain's intended to be very dangerous, and they're like, oh, cool, oh, that's really neat, and it's obviously a moment that I've crafted or whatever to be very serious. That just kind of bugs me. And I thought out loud to the viewers last video, is that even worth bringing up to the player? If so, how should I do it? And that sort of thing. So I had a couple different responses on that. One, Mike McCarthy said, I get your DM gripes. He said that kind of stuff grinds your gears. It also chaps my hide. The reckless do anything for a laugh or for a funny story moment. But he said it has a polar opposite, though, that can be just as frustrating. He said, here I'm thinking about players who become so concerned about and guarded about their characters that they are overly cautious, don't engage with the story much, and never take any chances because they don't want to die. Seems like the happy medium is the way to go. Well, Mike, as with most things in life, yes, the happy medium is probably the way to go. But at least the overly cautious character is acknowledging the danger, right? And not just like, oh, cool. So anyway, and again, I have to clarify, the player who does this in my campaign is a good player. I like the person. That's just one thing they do that I'm like, really? So, but anyway, okay. So Scrage Grimclaw, and he put quite a good comment in. So I would recommend going back to video 11 and reading that. But I really think he narrowed down. I'm not going to read everything because it's a good comment and he really explores it out. But I'll pick this out. I really think he hit it on the head. I think this is the way to handle it. He said you might be able to explain to them that even if they as players take things easy and don't care much about their characters' lives, that at least try to convey through their characters the feeling of fear and terror in the dungeon, and that they have an impact on the game's atmosphere, just like the GM by doing so. I think that's a great approach. He'll be like, hey man, I get, or hey gal, or whoever it is, I get that you're just cool, but character-wise, could you maybe, express a little bit of mortal fear or whatever to help with the atmosphere? Now, again, let me say that it depends on the tone of the group. I mean, there's some groups that play it all for laughs. There's some groups that play it super ultra serious and you can only talk in character and everything is super mega serious. And then there's some groups like mine that we have fun, but we also try to, at least pretend that things are serious, and has gravitas and that sort of thing. And maybe they don't want their characters to die. And that's kind of where we land. you know, and that's where we're at. I don't expect everything to be so uptight and serious that they have to. It's like being in a theater class where everything has to what's my character's motivation and what am I expressing at this. I don't want it to be like that. Don't get me wrong. Um, so as Mike said in his comment, happy medium is kind of what I'm looking for, and I don't feel that some of the things like smashing the kayak into the wall in the frictionless room just to see what would happen and leaving yourself stunned and half hit points while the party's fighting and impacting the party's ability to survive or fight is the right tone to strike in one of the most dangerous dungeons. So, but anyway, I've beat that horse till it is beyond dead, and I'll leave it alone. Now, one last thing that Scrage said was he said, everyone enjoys the game in different ways and it's unfair to expect everyone to treat it the same. As long as they don't destroy the game, that is. Okay, yes and no. I think I get what you're saying, that you can't expect everyone to want to experience the game the same way. But when it comes to the group, there's a group dynamic. There's either written or unwritten rules. There's a social compact on how we're going to enjoy this game together. So I'm glad that you put in that as long as they don't destroy the game, right? So anyway, enough on that. Thanks for your comments, Scrage. You also made a comment um, talking about the middle path of the dungeon, which my group is hopefully about to come to. You talked about the boiling lake ended up being quite easy for them. The crab, there's a giant crab, said his hard to the action economy destroyed him. The Kelpies encounter was very interesting and allowed our druid to pull some really cool tricks. The paladin got himself charmed and almost died. All in all, I think it's the easiest part of the dungeon. Yeah, and in future videos, I'll definitely go deeper into this as my players go through it. I will say the Kelpies, unless the dice rolls go just really bad, I don't see the Kelpies actually killing a character, although it can be a very interesting encounter. And we'll talk more about the Kelpies in a future video if people are like, what the heck's a Kelpie? Now, the giant crab and the boiling lake, that doesn't necessarily have to be uber dangerous, but this can be an insta-kill part of the dungeon. And again, we will get into it in future videos as my players get there, assuming that they do, which I assume they will. Because they've now handled the vampire, which we'll talk about here in a moment. There's a force field bubble that you go under this boiling hot lake, lethally boiling hot lake of water, not mud, but water, not mud like the geysers in Chains Room. There's a giant crab in there, and that's where Wave, the trident, is. If that force field bubble, which is kind of elastic almost, gets punctured, it can get deadly real super quick because that super hot boiling water just crashes in. Now, there's even the adventure has a way written in to escape that. But, if the players aren't to that point yet or decide not to use that, I mean, it can be insta-kill, insta-death almost immediately. So, yes, it could be a very straightforward fight, or it could be incredibly dangerous depending on if certain things happen. So, anyway, thanks for your comments on that, and I'm looking forward to sharing how my party handles the middle part, because there's the northeast, northeast, northwest, and then the straight north, and my party still has the north to go to. Okay, I think that is everything. So thanks so much for the viewer feedback. I'm going to take off my +3 spectacles of viewer feedback, and we will get into a couple of rules things, and then the recap of what happened last time. So, all right. So, a couple of things. One, I think this is an interesting rules clarification that came up during our most recent session. How often can a rogue sneak attack? All right. So here's the answer. All right. Only once per turn, period. But possibly more than once per round. Okay. A round is one round of combat where everybody takes their turns and then initiative starts over. A turn is one character taking their turn. All right. So the player's handbook on page 96 says, let's see here, page 96. It says, under the sneak attack, under the rogues, it says once per turn, you can deal an extra 1d6 damage to one creature you hit with an attack if you have advantage on the attack roll, etc., etc. As long as you qualify, and there's multiple, so go check out the qualifying conditions for sneak attack, including the attack must use a finesse or ranged weapon, and also you don't need advantage on the attack roll if another enemy of the target is within 5 feet of it. That enemy wasn't incapacitated, and you don't have disadvantage on the attack roll. So as long as you qualify for a sneak attack, you can do it once per turn, and there's multiple conditions you have to satisfy. But also, the sage advice on dndwizards.com from Rules and Answers February 2016 said the sneak attack description specifies that you can use the feature once per turn, but it's not limited to your turn. The feature also doesn't limit the number of times you can use it in a round. So if other circumstances come up that would trigger a sneak attack condition, and you haven't done it that turn, even if it's not that turn, even if it's not your turn, you can do it. So again, once per turn, but possibly more than once per round, you can use a sneak attack. So I thought that was an interesting rules clarification that came up in our group the other night. Also, I was like, what? Turned out, like in the middle of the fight, one of the players, like I said, how many hit points, what's your hit point maximum? And I think we were talking because the vampire, when they bite you, the necrotic damage drains your hit point maximum while healing the vampire for that much. And they said X amount. And for their race and class, I was like, that sounds kind of low. And everybody else was like, yeah, that sounds a little low. Come to find out, they were still using their 5th level hit points. They had never adjusted for 6th level. And I was like, wow. So, which I would assume they haven't updated their other stuff for 6th level either. So they've been playing this whole time, this whole adventure for White Plume Mountain. Everybody's 6th level. They've been playing like 5th level, and they were in Out of the Abyss. So, they didn't just roll up this new character. They made 6th level, and so they just never updated for some reason. And this is one of the players, I like them. I like having them in the group, but, they tend to have to ask other people. Like every time they do something, it's like, they're like, oh, what dice, whatever. So I think they're just playing more for the fun of playing. They don't care about all the math and the abilities and statistics, all that. However, it's a game that involves that. So if you're going to be a participant in the game, I do expect you to have, your character sheet up to date if possible. So, and I allowed them to update on the spot, and it turned out they were using taking the average each level. They weren't rolling. They were just doing the average each level. And I said, that's fine. But I did say to everybody, I said, hey, I expect y'all to keep your character sheets up. I don't want to have to be an annoying nanny and be double checking your character sheets. I don't want to be like, okay, pop quiz. I want to go through everybody's character sheets and see, I don't want to be, that's not fun. I don't want to be like that. But at the same time, last week, if you watched last week's video, a couple of people showed up and they had new characters and they didn't have their characters ready, even though they had 2 weeks to do it. And that I was like, really? And then this week, and it wasn't one of the same players, it was a different player, hadn't updated their character sheet to level 6. So, I was like, hey, I expect everyone to have their character sheets up to date. So, okay. That's it just for the clarifications and the rules and housekeeping on being a DM. Now, getting into the actual adventure, the players clarified something to me that I didn't catch or something last session. I had thought because the player that was Uzumaki, the Oriental fighter, who fell fighting, a little alliteration there, the felonious vampire, had carried and wielded Blackrazor, but knowing that they were probably going to their doom, they tossed Blackrazor down the corridor and went to the vampire room and said, run. So there was some discussion after they went back to the inn, after the vampire kicked their butts, basically, and they were licking their wounds and getting their relief characters and all that, and shooting eye daggers at the competing adventuring party that it showed up. I had heard that Blackrazor went into a bag of holding. That's what I had heard, so that's just what I had as the status of Blackrazor. Well, there was one character, there was one player whose character didn't die, but they wanted to switch characters. And I said, well, that's fine because there's a relief group coming from the guild, the Vanguard of the Eye, to replace the fallen characters. So with that, we'll say that your character is so shaken up, they don't want to go back in. I said, I'm fine with that. Well, it turns out this lone character, Scorch the Sorcerer, the female sorcerer, tiefling sorcerer, sent them hundreds of leagues, I think, back to, is it Phandalin, where they're based at, from the Lost Mine of Phandelver? Hundreds of leagues by themselves with Blackrazor wrapped in a bed sheet.
I'm like,
You know, I mean, I just, okay. I mean, I was like, I can't believe I caught that. Evidently, after the discussion of let's put Blackrazor in a bag of holding, there was some further discussion among the group, and that's what they ended up doing. And I mean, I just was like, so, I mean, this is one of the most famous weapons in D&D history. This is, the setting, the adventure hook, all of it implies that this is famous, and all these adventuring parties have tried White Plume Mountain to see if they could get this weapon. And I mean, it's a big deal. So I said, well, that's an idea. So I'm not saying it's a good idea, but it's an idea. And one of the players was like, "Oh, no, they had an escort from the Vanguard of the Eye." And I said, "What escort? All the relief characters have gone back into the mountain with you, so there's no escort." And so evidently there was discussion among the players, and I think one or two players dissented, but the majority ruled. So that's what they decided to do. And I just want to say that is definitely going to come back into play before the adventure is over. In fact, it plays into the end game that I have in mind for this adventure. But for the record, I mean, as DMs and GMs, whatever, we've got to be somewhat neutral and allow the players to do what they got to do. But as Shane,
I'm like, that was dumb.
I mean, that would, wow. I'm like, and even the veteran players looked a little embarrassed, as they were like, yeah, that probably wasn't the best idea. And I mean, I didn't say that was dumb. I just went, well, that's an idea. I'm not saying it's a good idea. But, they were like, yeah, on second thought, maybe that wasn't the best idea and all this stuff. So Scorch, the 6th level tiefling sorcerer, is, crossing the Forgotten Realms with a great sword wrapped in a bed sheet. And people know that a group has found Blackrazor. Word is getting out. Like I've implied and said outright on these videos, there are people who keep an eye on this village and keep an eye on White Plume Mountain. And, there's multiple factions in the Forgotten Realms. So all I'm going to say is this is definitely going to come back into play somehow. I don't know if I'm going to have a solo adventure, short adventure with the player, or I don't know what I'm going to do, but it's definitely going to come back into it. So, okay. There you go. That is what happened with the update on Blackrazor, and I was totally blown away. Totally blown away. All right, so okay, so getting back at the very end of last session, they had made it back to the vampire, and the door was open, and they had cast daylight and dispelled that darkness. And that's exactly where they're at. They saw kind of an empty room. They could see the coffin back there. They didn't know the exact dimensions of the room. So the coffin was replaced, that they had obliterated with fireball spells, but I did tell them there were like burns and scorch marks all over the back wall near the coffin and on the floor and all that from where they had thrown all those fireballs in. So they didn't see the vampire first. He was right off to the side, but I mean, they seemed pretty quick. Now, so the bard started singing Counter Charm, which is a bard ability that allows somebody within hearing to get advantage on saving throws against charm. The druid casts Moonbeam. And Moonbeam is this, it's like this 5 foot square uh, magic pillar of light kind of that can be moved around, and certain character or creature types, shapeshifters, which a vampire qualifies as a shapeshifter, if they begin their turn in the Moonbeam grid square, or if they enter it, they'll take damage. So that was thrown out there. Um, and I'm not sure if it's radiant damage. I'd have to look it up. But the dwarf, the vampire, once the vampire revealed himself and they started going into the room and fighting, the vampire was like, "Oh, my friend the dwarf," and he tried to charm him again, but the dwarf resisted the charm, even though it's like a DC 17 Wisdom, I think. And they, he had advantage because of the counter charm, but just by sheer rolls, even without the advantage, he would have made it because both rolls beat it. Now, I did not have, so the dwarf wasn't charmed, which was a major factor in the previous battle. I did not have the vampire use the Children of the Night ability to bring in the bats or rats or wolves or any of that. I don't think he can do wolves underground, but he could probably do rats and bats, and or I think either or swarms. And I didn't do that mainly for time. They've already fought the vampire. They've gotten the point that the vampire's super dangerous. The vampire's already killed 3 characters, and another one has basically quit. Another player, not player, but a character. So, the vampire's done his damage on this party as far as them, overcoming it and also getting the Whelm, the magical warhammer that he's guarding. However, I did use legendary actions to maximum effect. I think last time I did it to about 80% effect, and still lots of people died between the dwarf being charmed, the vampire's just inherent toughness and abilities, and then the room being dark and all that. Now this time, of course, they don't have the dark room. So that and the dwarf wasn't charmed, so things were going much. Even though the vampire is a tough opponent, still things were definitely going more in the party's favor. And they didn't use. I think they crafted some holy water before they went back in, and they never used the holy water, so they still have that. So, but I did use the legendary actions to maximum effect. The vampire gets 3 legendary actions, which reset on each of his turns, and at the end of a turn of another character or player or whatever, it can move. I think it can use each of these once. It can move without provoking an attack of opportunity. I guess that just reflects that super fast vampire speed. It can do a unarmed strike or or grapple, which is kind of the same ability, or it can bite. So in addition to its turn, where it can get 2 attacks and move, during 3 other turns when other characters or NPCs or whatever, it just says at the end of another character's turn or whatever, it can move again, and then it can bite, and then it can do an unarmed strike and either do damage or grapple. So this thing is tough, and it can turn into mist, and it can turn into a bat, and it regenerates, I think, 20 hit points at the beginning of every turn when it didn't take radiant damage on the previous, round before it got back to it. It gets hit points back when it sucks on blood. It lowers people's hit point maximum. The thing, it's resistant to a lot of weapons. This is nasty. It can charm children. It's just nasty. All right, this vampire is nasty. So even with the darkness dispelled, and and the characters were more prepared, and nobody got charmed, this vampire was still a tough opponent. The dwarf fighter went to 0 hit points. Basically their meat shield tank, and the druid was at 1 hit point. One slight different die roll, and the druid would have gone down as well. So this thing's still tough. I think even a higher, like this is a 6-level party, even though they have 7 party members. Even if a higher level party members, this thing's a tough opponent. Now, one thing that happened is the dwarf fighter, and this is why he went to 0 hit points, because after he did this, the vampire just went nuts on him and focused in on him alone. Before that, the vampire was kind of using its abilities to really harass and damage and hurt multiple people. The dwarf fighter went and attacked the coffin, I think he had a war mare. He's like, smash, smash. And so the adventure itself, White Plume Mountain, doesn't have uh, stats for the coffin, right? So what you could do is you can go to the Dungeon Master's Guide, and there's object rules on pages 246 and 247. Let's see here. 246 and 247. And what it does is it gives you armor class on page 246 for different types of materials, like cloth gets an AC 11, stone is 17, mithril is 21, adamantine is 23, iron is 19, wood or bone is 15, crystal, glass, ice is 13, etc. So I said, well, it's wood. So I said it has an armor class of 15. Now, obviously, objects aren't going to dodge and all that. This is just reflecting how hard it is to damage it, right? Even if you hit it, you got to damage it. So that's what the armor class reveals, just due to the inherent resilience or whatever of the object. Now, hit points, you go from tiny, which would be a bottle or a lock, for example, and it can be either fragile or resistant. For example, a tiny bottle would have, it would be fragile. It would get 1d4 hit points, or the average of 2. Or if it was resilient, which I would say a lock is resilient, it would get 2d4 or 5 hit points. So if you're trying to smash a lock off, like a padlock or something. And it goes from tiny to small to medium to large. Now, small would be a chest or like a magical, or not a magical, like a lute, the musical instrument lute. I felt that was too small for a coffin. Large would be a cart, a 10 by 10 foot window, like really large, and I felt that was slightly too big for a coffin. So I settled on medium, which would be like a barrel or a chandelier. A barrel. I said, well, barrel, it's not quite as big as a cart. It's not quite as small as a barrel, but that's close enough. I could have easily gone with large, and said it's a resilient coffin because this is important to the vampire. But I just said medium, and a resilient barrel gets an average of 18 hit points, or 4d8 dice worth of hit points. And I can't remember what the exact hit points are. I went ahead and rolled. I think it was a little slightly better than average, like 21 or 19 or something like that. But that's basically how I handled that. Now, you've also got rules here for huge and gargantuan objects. Normal weapons are of little use against huge and gargantuan objects, such as a colossal statue, towering column of stone, or massive boulder. Get objects and damage types. Objects are immune to poison and psychic damage. Da, da, da. You could say that, like, for example, wood would be vulnerable to, fire, or you could say that, certain stuff is resistant to bludgeoning, whatever. There's some good rules in here. And then it talks about damage thresholds, such as big objects such as castle walls often have extra resilience and etc. So I recommend that you go check out the rules on 246 and 247 of the Dungeon Master's Guide if you haven't already. This is where the Dungeon Master Guide gets really helpful. You're like, okay, you're attacking the coffin. How hard would that be? You just look up objects and go there, and there you go. So, yay, Dungeon Master's Guide, you came through for me. All right. So I think within one round, because the dwarf gets 3 attacks, fighter, 6th level fighter or whatever, it's like smash, 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 and I think destroyed the coffin in its round, and the vampire's like, Argh! And even though it had been hurting other characters, it just went straight for the dwarf and got on him. Another thing that happened that I want to point out, this isn't necessarily vampire specific, but it's a ruling I made, is that at one point, the vampire had a character grappled. It's really easy for a vampire to grapple because it can do an unarmed strike. And instead, if it's a successful unarmed strike, instead of dealing damage, bludgeoning damage or whatever, it can just choose to grapple. And it's like a DC 15 strength check, I think, to get out of that grapple. Maybe worse. I'm not sure. But anyway, it's not an easy check to get out of that grapple. Usually grapple is kind of an opposed check. But this is just, I got you, if I do a successful unarmed strike on you. And then if you're grappled, the vampire can bite you automatically without needing to make an attack roll. You're grappled, it just bites you. And that drains your hit points, lowers your hit point maximum, and gives it hit points back. So between the regeneration it gets at the beginning of the round, if it hasn't taken radiant damage, and the sucking blood, I mean, the vampires are tough. So, but anyway, the vampire had a character grappled, and another player unleashed 3 scorching rays, and 2 of them hit, and one of them I think critted, if I remember right. I'm not positive, but anyway, did some damage to the vampire from the scorching rays, which I think was fire damage, not radiant. You got to be really careful what kind of damage a vampire is taking. But anyway, I ruled that the grappled character took half that damage. And the player who threw the scorcher was what, and really kind of debating with me on it. And I'm like, dude, vampires, grappled up on this guy. They're basically in some ways like one object, one target. And so that's just what I ruled happened. So I don't know if the rules justify that. I didn't go follow up on that. But, he's like, what? And he was really kind of debating with me. Not in a jerky way, just really kind of debating. And then finally, one of the players was just like, dude, let it go. And he's like, okay. So, I gave my reasoning and then kind of moved on. So you may not handle it the same way, but as a DM, that's how I handled that. So, now another thing to point out, in the vampire's mist form, so he did start getting beat up, and he's like, boom, and turned to mist, and he started fleeing down the hallway to get out in the geysers and change room, and I guess just buy some time or something like that, go heal up for a few rounds and come back. I don't know what he was going to do. I just had him fleeing. He was down to 6 hit points. And he had taken radiant damage once or twice from cleric. I think there's a cleric spell. I can't remember what the name of it is. I don't know if it's Guiding Bolt or something, but it does radiant damage. The vampire got hit with that once or twice, which hurt. So the tide was really going against the vampire at this point, even though the fighter had gone down to 0 hit points and the druid was at 1 hit point. The writing was on the wall. So he's like, he took off in mist form. And one of the players in that narrow corridor that had worked so much against the players last fight worked for them sometime, because they moved the moonbeam spell out ahead of the vampire. And the vampire's like, because if it enters or begins its turn in the moonbeam square, it'll take the damage of the moonbeam spell. And it only had 6 hit points left. So it was like, it stopped before it got there. So it's kind of trapped. So that corridor ended up working for them this time. Remember, there's no, some people said, in this vampire fight, unbeatable. It's not unbeatable. You just have to have the right tactics. What can be a liability in one situation can turn out to be, something that helps you in approaching it from another direction. So anyway, so the vampire's like, and here's the thing: the vampire can take magical damage in mist form. It's resistant, or it's invulnerable or immune to pretty much all regular damage while it's in mist form, but it can take magical damage. So a couple of spells later, the vampire basically went to 0 hit points. So here's the thing to keep in mind. The vampire, when it gets reduced to 0 hit points, by the book, it's supposed to turn to mist and then go seek out its resting place, its coffin, basically. It was already in mist form, so I just said, the mist seems to change slightly, and then it makes a beeline for the destroyed coffin. And what's supposed to happen is it automatically transforms to mist, and it seeks out its coffin. It goes in its coffin, and it's there. It's paralyzed. It turns back into its physical form, and there's the classic Hollywood, whatever. In fact, one of the players was doing that when I was describing the vampire was back in its resting place. The coffin's destroyed, but it reformed in its physical form and was laying in kind of the shattered remains of the coffin, and it's paralyzed until it gets back to 1 hit point. And I think it takes like an hour or 2 for it to get back to 1 hit point. So what they did, it materialized on top of the pieces of the destroyed coffin. So they staked it. And if you take a wooden stake and put it through the heart of a vampire while it's paralyzed, it will remain paralyzed, I guess, no matter how many hit points it has until that stake is removed. And to add insult to injury, they staked it with a piece of its own shattered coffin. And then they killed it by the druid letting the moonbeam spell just set on top of the vampire and it was, doing damage and causing it to fail, to take death save fails until it died. And at that point, for effect, I just said that it crumbled away. The vampire crumbled away. Um, I don't. It may or may not be written in the vampire rules in the monster manual what happens when they actually die, but I just went with the classic, Hammer horror movie. It just crumbles away kind of thing from its great age. Now, um, in the death saves, I don't know if we've talked about these or not, but page 197, I'll just take this opportunity because the question was asked, like, okay, how many death saves does it take, and how does it take death saves, and blah, 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 or what happens if it takes damage. Page 197 of the player's handbook talks about death saves. Of course, if you go to 0 hit points, you start making death saves. You roll a d20 each round. No bonuses, no modifier, just straight. It's you and the fates. There's no, your Constitution help. No Constitution doesn't help. None of that helps. It actually says in the book, says you're in the hands of fate now, aided only by spells and features that improve your chances of succeeding on a saving throw. So this one is, unlike other saving throws, this one isn't tied to any ability score. So there may be some sort of ability you have that gives you bonuses or something, or chances of succeeding on a saving throw, but your actual abilities don't matter. But if you have some sort of class ability or something, or I don't know, maybe some magic item. So you roll a d20. If the roll is 10 or higher, you succeed. Otherwise, you fail. A success or failure has no effect by itself. On your third success, you become stable. Or, which basically I think you mean you're like unconscious with 1 hit point or something like that, if I remember right. And then on your third failure, you die. The successes and failures don't need to be consecutive. You just keep track of both until you collect 3 of a kind. The number of both is reset to 0 when you regain any hit points or become stable. So there you go. So 3 days later, if you go to 0 hit points again, those previous death save successes or failures don't matter. When you make a death saving throw and roll a 1 on the d20, it counts as 2 failures, basically a critical fail. If you roll a d20 on the if you roll a 20 on the d20, you regain 1 hit point. So you automatically stabilize and get 1 hit point. Okay, so a stable creature doesn't make death saving throws, even though it has 0 hit points, but it does remain unconscious. So if you get stabilized, if you succeed in 3 death saving throws, then you don't continue to make death saving throws. You're stabilized, but you're at 0 hit points. But if you roll a 20 on a d20 while you're making your saving throws, you regain 1 hit point, which I guess would assume you wake up, and you're at 1 hit point, which means you're at full ability in D&D. You could just go back to 0 real quick again. So if you take any damage, and this is what came up, like we're like, okay, how hard is it to kill the vampire now? If you take any damage while you have 0 hit points, you suffer a death saving throw failure immediately. If the damage is from a critical hit, you suffer 2 failures. If the damage equals or exceeds your hit point maximum, you suffer instant death. So basically, like in the vampire's case, you just have to damage it 3 times, and then it's dead. Right? Or crit once and hit it another time. That would be 3 total death saving throws. In addition to any that is made or failed. So it's at 0 hit points. They put Moonbeam on it, and 2 or 3 rounds later, it's dead. So that's how they killed the vampire, and it crumbled away, and is like good parties everywhere. They said, "Well, can we loot the crumbled remains?" I'm like, "There's really nothing to loot." However, the warlock cast detect magic, and underneath the coffin, that's where the loot is that the vampire is guarding. So let's see here. The space beneath the coffin contains Whelm, a sentient warhammer, 10,000 silver pieces, 9,000 gold pieces, and 6 leather sacks, a potion of mind reading, and 3 spell scrolls, which have conjure minor elementals, dispel magic, and magic mouth. So what I ruled, well, first of all, I said there's a really big glow after you cast magic missile coming out of the space below the coffin, kind of in between the broken coffin pieces. And but I did rule, as I speculated I might before, that all the treasure except for Whelm was destroyed by the just repeated fireballs, just blasted. And I know you could make the case, well, maybe the gold and the silver melted down. I just said it's all destroyed. And I kind of did that to, when you're just fireball, 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 which they've done more than once as a group in both Out of the Abyss and in this adventure. Yeah, it does a lot of damage and it can be effective, but there can be a downside too. And I mean, they told me, I didn't encourage them, I didn't fudge this. They were, the way they told me they were targeting the fireballs when the room was full of darkness and they were just casting in there, the fireballs would have hit right on the coffin and right, where that is underneath. So they obliterated the first coffin and then just fireball, 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 fireballed everything underneath it. But Whelm, being Whelm, survived unscathed. So, and I ruled that Whelm, like immediately, because it's another sentient weapon with its own voice and intelligence and all that, was like immediately all about the dwarven fighter. It was like, hello, and I said that it had a voice and accent like Billy Connolly, playing the dwarf in the Hobbit movie. I think he comes riding over on a big hog or maybe a big ram or something, and he's like, "Ah, we're here now, boys," or whatever. I'm not even gonna try to do it, but I said Whelm sounds just like Billy Connolly playing the dwarf in the Hobbit movie. That great Scottish kind of, gusto accent.
You hear that, lads? We're on! Let's give these bastards a good hammering!
And he was like, "Oh yeah," he was all happy to be with his dwarf, and the player who had gotten Blackrazor was like, "What?" Because Blackrazor was and is a jerk. Which even makes more sense now, because in the books of the Elric, like we talked about at the beginning of the video, Blackrazor is based on Stormbringer from the Elric books by Michael Moorcock. Stormbringer's a massive jerk. So makes even more sense now. But he's like, what? So let's go over Whelm's stats really quickly in the Dungeon Master's Guide, just so you know what Whelm has. But yeah, Whelm was all about, they had a dwarf with them, and Whelm was all about, what's up? He's all loving the dwarf. So, Whelm, page 218 on the Dungeon Master's Guide. Whelm it's a Warhammer weapon, legendary, and it requires attunement by a dwarf. By a dwarf! So if they hadn't had a dwarf with them, nobody could have wielded Whelm. There's another tongue twister. How much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? All right. She sells seashells by the seashore. All right. Whelm is a powerful warhammer forged by dwarves and lost in the dungeon of White Plume Mountain. You gain a +3 bonus to attack and damage rolls made with this magic weapon. At dawn, the day after you first make an attack roll with Whelm, you develop a fear of being outdoors that persists as long as you remain attuned to the weapon. This causes you to have disadvantage on attack rolls, saving throws, and ability checks while you can see the daytime sky. Thrown weapon. I love this ability of Whelm. Whelm has the thrown property with a normal range of 20 feet and a long range of 60 feet. When you hit with a ranged weapon attack using it, the target takes an extra 1d8 bludgeoning damage or an extra 2d8 bludgeoning damage if the target is a giant. Each time you throw the weapon, it flies back to your hand after the attack. That's so sweet. Like Thor. If you don't have a hand free, the weapon lands at your feet. Shockwave. You can use an action to strike the ground with Whelm and send a shockwave out from the point of impact. Bam! Each creature of your choice on the ground within 60 feet of that point must succeed on a DC 15 Constitution saving throw or become stunned for 1 minute. In combat, 1 minute's a long time. That's 6 rounds? No, 10 rounds? I think a round or a turn is... A round is 6 seconds, I think. A creature can repeat the saving throw at the end of each of its turns, ending the effect on itself on a success. Once used, this property can't be used again until the next dawn. Supernatural awareness. While you are holding the weapon, it alerts you to the location of any secret or concealed doors within 30 feet of you. In addition, you can use an action to cast Detect Evil and Good or Locate Object from the weapon. Once you cast either spell, you can't cast it from the weapon again until the next dawn. Sentience. Whelm is a sentient, lawful, neutral weapon with an intelligence of 15, a wisdom of 12, and a charisma of 15. It has hearing and dark vision out to a range of 120 feet. The weapon communicates telepathically with its wielder and can speak, read, and understand Dwarvish, Giant, and Goblin. It shouts battle cries in Dwarvish when used in combat. Exactly like Billy Connolly. Okay, so personality. Whelm's purpose is to slaughter giants and goblinoids. It also seeks to protect dwarves against all enemies. Conflict arises if the wielder fails to destroy goblins and giants or to protect dwarves. So there are some strings attached here. Especially that, disadvantage in daylight thing. I guess it's used to being underground. Whelm has ties to the dwarf clan that created it, variously called the Dankle or the Mighty Hammer clan. It longs to be returned to that clan. It would do anything to protect those dwarves from harm. Okay, so here's where the lore of Whelm ties into White Plume Mountain. I didn't use this, but you can if you want. The hammer also carries a secret shame. Centuries ago, a dwarf named Satinmir wielded it valiantly for a time. But Satinmir was turned into a vampire. His will was strong enough that he bent Whelm to his evil purposes, even killing members of his own clan. And Satinmir, yes, is the name of the vampire in White Plume Mountain. So there you go. That is Whelm. Now, so for now they did take a long rest immediately after defeating the vampire and recovering the loot in the vampire's room, and they cast Liamon's tiny hut and stayed in there. And I said for now the dwarf did attune to Whelm, and I said for now he gets the +3 to attack and damage rolls for now. Whelm needs to wake up, and I'm going to do that with with Blackrazor, Whelm, and Wave. They've been down here so long, they've got to kind of wake up. And as the more the players use them after attuning to them, the more abilities will come back out. And this was actually, and I'm doing this for game balance because they're 6th level characters. It's very overpowering to have these mighty of weapons at 6th level. But this was a viewer feedback suggestion. Somebody said, hey, wouldn't it be cool? And thanks for the great suggestion. I can't remember who that was. I haven't had a chance to go back through. But if you were the one that made that suggestion, put in the comments and I'll make sure to give you a shout out, in a future video. But I think that was a great suggestion and that's the way I went. I hadn't thought of that on my own. Now, Blackrazor's doing the same thing, but he was covering that up and blustering and all that with Uzumaki. Like, when you earn my abilities and show you're worthy, even though I did have Blackrazor during one fight say, well, let me give you a taste of what you could have, and gave him some more abilities like haste and some other stuff. I hadn't totally decided that I was going with the waking up thing yet, but that was what Blackrazor was doing too. Again, this is mainly for game balance as the characters are still, 6th level. They did the long rest in the vampire's room, Liamon's tiny hut, the dwarf attuned to Whelm, and I should have said, because at dawn, I think the darkness comes back. I didn't even think to do that. It wouldn't have had a combat effect on the game, but it would have had a cool atmospheric effect. Yeah, the magical darkness is dispelled. It renews again automatically at dawn. So I should have ruled that you guys wake up or whatever, and it's completely pitch black dark, magical darkness again. It wouldn't have hurt them. I mean, the warlock has true sight, could have gotten them out of there no problem and all that stuff. And they had an idea of the dimensions of the room and where the door was, but still, it would have been kind of a nice touch. So I said that they didn't need to roll or anything to get back through the chains and geysers room. I mean, the point's been made with that room. They've done the exercise more than once to get through the room. They're not being chased. They're not being pursued. There's no real narrative, excitement, reason. They've kind of figured the room out now. And the druid, but the druid did change into a giant snake again, and the warlock cast flight again. And then they did the magic giant snake adventures, which I think should totally be an animated series back across to get out. Now the druid used the 3rd level spell of Erupting Earth to take care of the turnstile on the way out. So as is fair enough, you erupt all the stone and earth around it, and it just, you guys can get by it. And so let me make a point that even though they're not rolling or we're not making a big deal about getting out of the vampire area, I still ask them, okay, you track your spell, you cast Erupting Earth, you cast Flight, you've used, your wild shape or whatever, turn into a giant snake. So even though it wasn't, rolling and this and that, I still want them to track that they use those abilities and spells. And we finished the session. They did finally decide to go down that southern corridor they hadn't gone down yet on this side of the dungeon, and I ended up at room 4, the glass globes room. And one player, like the most experienced player in the group, he's like, "Oy vey, why? We basically done this part of the dungeon. Let's get out of here." But the other person's like, "No, we want to go check it out." Squirrel, which I'm glad they did because it's an interesting room. But so initially, what it is just this room that, and I went over it last time. I'll go over it more in depth next video. But it's a 30 by 30 room that has 9 glass globes hanging in a grid that you can't see them. They're like silvered glass globes hanging by unbreakable threads from the ceiling. And this is definitely a trap room. You can get some loot and stuff out of here, but it's a puzzle / trap room. Some of those globes have monsters inside of them. Some of them have useless loot. Some of them loot. All of them have a key, but only one key can get people out of the room. And there's another thing that will happen, which we'll go into next video, because I covered it in depth last video. And I'll cover it again next video since that's the room they're going to be in. They tinkered around with it a little bit. They checked the threads for traps, so there's no traps. They're like doing somebody getting up on somebody's shoulders. They're messing around. Somebody threw detect magic, and it doesn't explicitly say that the threads are magic, but I said that the globes don't glow necessarily, but the threads glow. Now, some of the stuff inside the globes might glow, but since they're mirrored, you can't see it. You wouldn't see the glow coming out. And so there's some tinkering, this and that, kind of tugging on them. And some players stayed out. A couple others went in. They're being very cautious, suspecting a trap. Now, what's supposed to happen is the door is supposed to slam shut. As in the book says, when everybody that is going to go in has gone in, the door slams shut, and you cannot open that door back up. There's no way to open that door back up. You have to go through the puzzle of the globes. So what I'm going to do is, if at the beginning of next session, if they keep being super cautious and kind of hemming and hawing around, then I'll just, at some point, I'm just going to have the door slam shut, and whoever's in there is in there. And then that's how we'll play it. But we will pick up there next time on the Shane Plays Note series for White Plume Mountain, updated to 5th edition from Tales from the Yawning Portal. Thanks so much for watching. Please leave this video a thumbs up and maybe a comment, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we will catch you next time on Shane Plays. Thanks so much for watching.